Yeah, there are schemes around the country that are set up with volunteers offering to help in emergencies, but they may not be as common as you might think, which is why Ready for Anything really is special and certainly exceptional from what I've heard here. They are so important, partly because the people who often volunteer come from the communities who have been or are going to be affected by a disaster. So who better to understand what the community is like and what people within a affected community need than those who come from and live in and are going to stay within a community long after the disaster as well. So one of the benefits of Ready for Anything and these kinds of schemes is that they really are by and for members of the community. One of the other benefits is that the people who volunteer for such schemes come forward before disaster strikes, and again that's really helpful because we know that disasters bring out the best in people. Often people want to help, they want to give donations, turn up and support the response, but that can itself be a challenge, managing those spontaneous volunteers. So having people who signed up and are ready for anything in advance is a real asset to the authorities. And I think one of the benefits of Ready for Anything is not only that it helps the emergency response, but also it brings benefits to the volunteers as well. There's lots of research that shows how people's health and happiness is rewarded when you give to others. So a further benefit of a scheme like Ready for Anything is that it brings benefits to the volunteers as well. Often volunteers will say that's not why they do it, but it's nice to know that there's a payoff for them too. But I think I would say the biggest benefit is also to those who, at the hardest time in their lives, get the benefit from knowing that people care. So Ready for Anything is an example of a scheme that really harnesses the power of kindness. And I say that both professionally and knowing the evidence tells us that trauma, community trauma, collective trauma in disaster is mitigated by knowing that there are people there to help. Volunteers do a number of things that are different but really complementary to the authorities. And the authorities these days very much focus on the idea of a collaborative, multi-agency kind of approach. They have some nice acronyms like GESIP that's around working together jointly. And that really, I think Ready for Anything testifies to the contribution that volunteers make that is distinctly different from the authorities. An example of that is the fact that, like when we see a disaster on the television or in the media, when a disaster strikes, there's a lot of interest by the public, by the media, by politicians, and obviously by the emergency services. And then, quite rightly, everybody goes home. And that's when it can feel really lonely, living with the trauma, even if, for example, after floods, when the water has gone away, the trauma doesn't end. And that's when you really can feel most lonely. Everybody was there at the beginning, but then they've gone. And so the volunteers within a community who not only stay, but understand and reach out and are just there in the longer term is really something that makes a difference. And that is an example of something that really those who are based within a community in the longer term, the difference that they can make. Sometimes when you have a scheme like Ready for Anything, people sign up and they're ready to be deployed. But ironically, you don't really want to be needed. And that is also something you need from a volunteer, somebody who's prepared to be there, but not to be needed. At the same time, one of the really valuable things that Ready for Anything does is bring the volunteers together in peacetime, not only when there's a training or exercising scenario, but at a time like today where you can come together, meet each other, have a nice feed and some nice drinks, and just learn about emergencies, but really to network with other people and be appreciated and thanked for the fantastic work that volunteers do. And what we also know from the response to disasters is that we can measure success in dealing with disaster in quantifiable terms, how many people have been helped, how much money has been raised. But one of the harder to measure, but no less significant ways of measuring the impact of something like Ready for Anything is how people feel. And that is often the testimony that comes from survivors of incidents, but also from volunteers who on a day like today will come together and share what it feels like to be appreciated and valued and to know that they've made a difference with people.